Good evening and welcome to the Institute for Advanced Study. And my role here at this moment is basically to introduce the moderator and organizer of this event, Casey Cole. Casey is a director's visitor here at the Institute, and she's an incredibly talented both science writer and just a force of nature in bringing the sciences, the arts, and the public together. And she usually does this in this Categorically Not series, which is on the West Coast. I'm just saying, though, by applying the principle of relativity, we felt that you could also come here instead of all of us go to your event. So we're very happy to organize this afternoon together with Nautilus magazine and website. Casey will say more about the theme, On the Edge, which sounds already very good. But just a few words about her. I think there are many connections to the Institute, but one recent one that she wrote a beautiful piece for Quanta magazine about the work of Juan Maldacena here, that you all know, famous physicist. But she has been a science writer for the LA Times for a very long time. She's also a professor at the Annenberg School for Communications Journalism at the University of Southern California. Writing has appeared in many publications, Discover, Wired, the New Yorker, New York Times, etc., etc., etc. She's the author of 8 non-fiction books, and there the second connection comes with is that she wrote this absolutely beautiful and lovely biography of her late mentor, the self-proclaimed uncle of the atomic bomb and founder of San Francisco's world-renowned Museum of Awareness, the Exploratorium, Frank Oppenheimer, the younger brother of Robert Oppenheimer. And that, of course, is another strong connection to the Institute, but because Robert was the third director here. That book, Something Incredibly Wonderfully Happens, Frank Oppenheimer and his astonishing Exploratorium, is well recommended. In the review of the book in the LA Times, it was written, like one of Oppenheimer's science classes or a visit to the Exploratorium, this joyful and loving portrait has the potential to change minds and makes explorers of us all. And I think that really captures, I think, your task in life in general. She has received many awards, too many to mention all of them. I just mentioned here the American Institute of Physics Prize for Science Writing, the LA Times Award for Explanatory Journalism, the Edward R. Murrows Award for thoughtful coverage of scientific controversies, and the Exploratorium's its own Public Understanding of Science Award, presented by Frank Oppenheimer just the year before his death. So I'm incredibly pleased to introduce Casey Cole.
Hi, everybody. It's such a delight to be here for so many reasons. There are so many threads that tie all of these things together, and I'm going to try to get through them just as rapidly as I can. I first want to tell you what categorically not means. It came from an artist friend of mine who liked to say that the worst disease afflicting humankind was hardening of the categories. This was Bob Miller, who was kind of immortalized, if you will, in Muriel Rukeyser's poem, The Sun Artist. And both Bob and Muriel were part of a crazy experiment that was going on in San Francisco in 1969. I was working at a magazine, the Saturday Review, some of you may actually remember, and was sent to check out this crazy guy who was doing something bizarre in the old Palace of Fine Arts, which was 90,000 square feet of space. Tennis courts were in there, it was an army garage, all kinds of things. And I entered this, I can only describe it as a playground, as the most magnificent playground I have ever seen, with no rules and no guards and hundreds of scientific, and not just scientific, but scientific toys. The first thing you noticed was you could hear sounds and beeps and buzzing and running feet and people laughing and saying, hey, come look at this, and small children and old people just in deep thought and playing with stuff. And the stuff was amazing. There were lasers and lenses and microscopes and gyroscopes and magnets and, I mean, just on and on. Just playthings, a lot of mechanical and electrical playthings too that were just there to break with. There was no right way to get through. There was nothing you couldn't do or nothing you couldn't break. That was part of the design. In fact, well, I won't get ahead of myself, but above the busy machine shop was this hand-painted sign from Barbara Gamow, actually, made it, and it said, "Here is being created a community museum of human awareness, the Exploratorium." When I found the director, he was this skinny guy with wild hair and a cloud of sawdust and putting out cigarette butts in his pocket, and he'd occasionally grab his flute. He was a very nice musician. The smoke would waft from the holes. And the way he talked about science, I had never heard anybody talk about science that way before. It was as a way of looking at the world that was important for all of us to know, and it applied to absolutely everything. He said that artists and scientists were the official noticers of society, those who notice things that other people either never learned to see or learned to ignore, and then to communicate those noticings to others. Then when I went back to my editor and told him about this day, he said, "Did this fellow have twinkly blue eyes?" And I said, "Well, yes." He said, "Well, then he must be the younger brother of Robert Oppenheimer," which is how I found out something about his past. I wish I had time to tell you about Frank, the history. I don't, except that he loved physics and was a wonderful physicist. He got involved with the atomic bomb. Of course, he never got over what he called all those flattened people. He got caught in the Red Scare and was banished from physics. He became a cattle rancher and a school teacher. And he became convinced through all of these experiences that the most important thing was to endow people with a sense that they could understand the world, that they could understand things for themselves, or at least that somebody could understand them. Because when people are just afraid and confused by everything around them, obviously they get afraid and they get apathetic, and then they stop participating in any process, political process or any process. Of course, Lucretius said much the same thing, but we just keep reinventing things. So he really created the Exploratorium to foster this kind of understanding so that we could use persuasion to change each other's minds instead of coercion. We had a better weapon out there. So one of the things that happened there was it became a magnet for innovation. This is where it really reminds me of the Institute, because John Cage came and created music there, Muriel Rukeyser, many other poets and writers, but also physicists of all kinds. Bob Wilson, who created Fermilab, made a little miniature version of it. There were bunches of them, Phil and Philip Morrison, Louis Alvarez, pieces of SLAC, linear accelerator, which was just being created, were brought and put there. And what made it some place everybody wanted to come to was that it was a place of real play, not play where you want to win something, but play where you do things just for the heck of it, and chances are you're going to fall flat on your face. So people loved that, and they came, and that obviously is the grounding of Categorically Not. All the ideas come from that. Just quickly, it wasn't a thing then. Frank died, and finding a way to carry it on. And luckily, I found a like-minded friend in Raoul Hoffman. Some of you may know, beautiful writer, poet, and also a Nobel laureate in chemistry. And I was writing a book about nothing. I wanted to do a reading at the Cornelia Street Cafe. I was told I wasn't famous enough. I said, my friend Raoul, he's got a Nobel Prize. He writes books on poetry. Not famous enough. So we started collaborating with Oliver Sacks, who was great and always up for any kind of play, and now we were famous enough, and so that started Entertaining Science, which is now at the Cornelia Street Cafe every Sunday, first week of the month, every Sunday. And then when I went to Los Angeles, it just turned out that the LA Philharmonic had a new building and was starting off with a creation festival, and the musicologist who was talking about Haydn wanted me to talk about the creation of the universe and the creation of matter. So we had something there, and then all we needed was a venue, and we found one in an old airplane hangar, very much like the Exploratorium, where it's Santa Monica Art Studios. So, as you can see, everything really very much pulled together. And the last little piece of this is the Nautilus connection, which you mentioned somewhat. I was writing for a wonderful new magazine that I'd been reading but not contributing to, called Nautilus. And as we got to talking, we realized that we did the same thing, was to take a single theme and to play around with it from many, many different kinds of perspectives. So coming here, it just seemed to be full circle in so many ways. I just want to say a word about edges and how we got there. And Robbert is right. It really came from talking with Juan Maldacena about black hole horizons and how you store information on horizons and trying to think about, well, where is the horizon and what is it? And you realize that every kind of edge, wall, limit, horizon is a really interesting place where many, many, many interesting things are happening. And we're going to be hearing about that tonight from these wonderful speakers who've traveled a long way, and I thank them so much in advance. Sean Carroll, I think the main thing I'm going to mention, we're supposed to keep this short, author of so many beautiful books, Endless Forms, Most Beautiful, Remarkable Creatures, but I have to say that he recently won the Rockefeller University Lewis Thomas Prize for writing about science. That was great. He's going to tell you about his new book, The Serengeti Rules. Felice Frankel, I've known for a long time from her image and meaning conferences she used to put on through MIT. She's a master visualizer, writer. I use her books in my classes all the time. She'll tell you more about that. Probably Helen Fisher, you've probably heard of, because if you're ever talking about relationships, somebody's going to say, well, Helen Fisher says. And she is known mostly for her classic book, just republished now, right? The Anatomy of Love. And then Robbert, of course, who's going to help us tie all this together, wonderful director, mathematical physicist, who brought me here, which makes me think that Michael Faraday was right and nothing is too wonderful to be true. So thank you all for coming. And Sean, you're up.
Well, thank you. What's a snake catcher from Toledo doing in a place like this, huh? I was remarking as I came out, I'm glad there was no math test, to get onto campus. Your suspicions about biologists are true. So I just wrote a book that crossed a wide, tall, and long-standing boundary in biology. And there's been a cultural, institutional, and intellectual boundary, more like a canyon, between molecular biology and ecology for about 50 years, ever since kind of various acrimonious divorces across campuses a half-century ago. And that estrangement is best encapsulated by the story of the frosty relationship between two of its most luminary figures. In the 1960s, Harvard, the Department of Biology at Harvard, had both, if you can do the slides on, had both E.O. Wilson and Jim Watson. And I'm going to tell you a little story that Ed Wilson tells in his book, Naturalist. He said, one day at a department meeting, I brought up, this is Ed chose to argue that the department needed more young evolutionary biologists for balance. And at least we should double the number from 1 to 2, Ed said. Ed raised the case of an outstanding population ecologist and stressed the importance of teaching environmental biology, to which Watson replied, and I hope this is working, your clicker, there it is, anyone who would hire an ecologist is out of his mind. So here's how Ed describes Watson in this chapter called Molecular Wars out of Naturalist. When he was a young man in the 1950s and 1960s, I found him the most unpleasant human being I had ever met. He came to Harvard as an assistant professor in 1956, also my first year at the same rank. At 28, he was only a year older. He arrived with a conviction that biology must be transformed into a science directed at molecules and cells and rewritten in the language of physics and chemistry. What had gone before, traditional biology, my biology, Ed says, was infested by stamp collectors who lacked the wit to transform their subject into a modern science. He treated most of the other 24 members of the Department of Biology with a revolutionary's fervent disrespect. At department meetings, Watson radiated contempt in all directions. He shunned ordinary courtesy and polite conversation, evidently in the belief that they would only encourage the traditionalists to stay around. His bad manners were tolerated because of the greatness of the discovery he had made and because of the gathering aftermath. In the 1950s and 1960s, the molecular revolution had begun to run through biology like a flash flood. Watson, having risen to historic fame at an early age, became the Caligula of biology. Okay. So after that ecology hiring incident, Ed suggested to his colleagues that they even stop using the word ecology, and shortly thereafter, the ecological and molecular tribes split. And that kind of scenario was repeated on lots and lots of campuses across the country and across the world. Now, I've been a lifelong member of that molecular tribe, and so what triggered my crossing over? So I'm going to tell you a little story. It's really sort of a combination of inspiration and ignorance, and they both materialized on the Serengeti in Tanzania. So this is the entrance to Serengeti National Park. Not quite the grand entrance I was expecting when I arrived there with my family. Not exactly a greeting, no toll booth. You enter in on this gravel road, and after a while, as you kind of weave your way in and get deeper into the park, things like this appear. This is actual home footage. I know that's not the sort of thing you should show friends, but here we go. So coming over a rise, getting near some water hole. Yes, this is real footage. Surrounded by probably a couple thousand zebra, stripes everywhere, a biologist dreamscape out on the horizon, a troop of elephants coming down to this water hole. And from that moment on, the Serengeti just offered up an endless parade of animals of all sizes and shapes and colors, including things like my favorite, which were majestic giraffes. I made the driver stop every time we saw a giraffe, which was probably like 300 stops in 5 or 6 days. But as I looked, I was awestruck. No matter what I had seen on TV, so much I had seen, so much I had read, it still floored me. And what really floored me was the numbers of animals, the sheer numbers of animals. But while I was also awestruck, I realized I was completely ignorant. I did not have a clue of what I was looking at. I didn't understand such simple things as, for example, why were there so many, it's a little reluctant, there it is, why were there so many wildebeest in the Serengeti and so few topi, a similar sized animal? So, as a professional biologist, this was kind of embarrassing because here I am. I'm looking at the Serengeti. It's our homeland. This is the area, this is the kind of place where our species evolved, and I just didn't understand the whole picture, or any part of it, really. Now, I did know a few things from studying biology for several decades, and I do understand a lot about what goes on inside animal bodies and inside human bodies. And one thing that's certainly true is that everything inside our bodies is regulated. There's probably 30,000 substances in our bodies, and the amount of each of those substances is regulated. Fats, salts, hormones like insulin, enzymes that digest your food, all regulated, maintained in a fairly narrow range. Some things are incredibly abundant, some things are incredibly scarce, but maintained in those ranges nonetheless. Also know that every cell type in the body, white cells, red cells, skin cells, liver cells, are produced in pretty constant amounts, maintained in a pretty constant range. And that because everything's regulated, molecular biologists, my tribe, have spent the last 50 or 60 years trying to figure out how those things are regulated. How does life, at that level at least, really work? And the strategy, the general strategy, is to understand these rules of regulation, has been to identify, to use a little sports analogy, the key players, the molecules that regulate a process, and there's usually something sort of in charge of these particular processes. And the Nobel Prizes for physiology or medicine sort of mark the discovery of lots of these key molecules over the last 50 or 60 years. And to figure out the rules that govern their play. How do these molecules interact with other things in the body to have a particular outcome? And this knowledge has been very empowering, incredibly impressive, and I think that's where a lot of the pride and priority in molecular biology comes from, because it's triggered a revolution in medicine. Because this knowledge has told us, well, not only is everything regulated, but really disease is pretty much, very often, a matter of abnormal regulation, where too much or too little of something is produced. And when we know how those things are regulated, that equips physicians and pharmaceutical companies with the knowledge to do something about it. So that our pharmacies are full of drugs that modulate the amounts of things. So get familiar examples, for example, human insulin on the left for diabetics, on the right, Lipitor, a typical statin that's used to regulate cholesterol for some number of people. I'm going to take a wild stab in this room while I speak. And that's all based on our understanding the details, for example, of how cholesterol is regulated. So we've learned all this about 50 or 60 for over these 50 or 60 years, but I'm sitting there in the Serengeti clueless as to why there's 1 million wildebeest out there, why there's only a couple thousand elephants. I don't understand any of this. And so I decided that I would try to probe and see if anybody knew anything about this. I certainly hadn't met anyone in the course of more than a 30-year plus biology career who did know anything about it. They weren't in my tribe. So that question led me to pursue the broader question of how are the numbers of animals and plants regulated in nature. And the question I focused on, and in probing it, led me to wind up writing this book that Casey mentioned, is to just ask, well, I know there's rules at the molecular and cellular scale, but are there rules at a larger scale in nature? And if so, what are those rules? And I just conveniently dubbed those the Serengeti rules because they taught this molecular biologist what was going on in the Serengeti. And again, those rules, as it turns out they do exist, are empowering because, we can use them, we could potentially use them as the same way we use the rules we've understood in medicine to either preserve or to repair the world's ecosystems. And what I learned from these rules is that there are these mechanisms that regulate the amounts of things in nature at these larger scales. And when I saw what had been discovered, there was a tremendous rush of familiarity. Because while the rules were not exactly the same, the particulars were not exactly the same, I'd seen that logic before. I'd seen the logic of things like feedback regulation at the deep molecular scale, worked on it myself. I'd seen lots of ways that nature controls events with sort of negative checks and balances on processes. Saw the same thing going on in nature, not just in the Serengeti, but in every habitat that had been studied across the world. I also learned that just like inside the body, when regulation is broken and you get cancer like this, which is these large cells or the overproliferation of white cells in a typical leukemia, that cancer takes various forms in the biosphere. It takes the form, for example, of an infestation of insects in a rice field, where because of something that we do, we break the natural regulation that's going on in this field. Farmers are overwhelmed with massive numbers of insects that consume their rice, brown out the field, actually can cause massive food shortages and major problems with food security across Asia. I'd grown up looking at the next picture and didn't realize until further study from ecology that I was looking at a cancer. This is an algal bloom, which for me was a familiar sight because this is an algal bloom on a lake where I grew up, which happens to be Toledo, Ohio. It was a lake that I never swam in, I never fished in, I just never even put any part of my body in, never ate anything that came out of it my entire childhood, partly for reasons as you're seeing. But what these algal blooms that are visible from space, what they represent are the massive proliferation of these single-celled creatures because of really a breakdown of regulation in the natural systems that are there in the lake. So this is telling us that we need to understand these rules of regulation, that they are potentially more important, could wind up being far more important than all the molecular rules that we may ever discover. So that motivated me to try to bring the stories together of the pioneers who discovered these rules and the pioneers who discovered the rules inside the body to build a bridge over that long-standing boundary between ecology and molecular biology. And the main message that I wanted to deliver is that really if you look at all the gains we've made, especially in lifespan and quality of life in the 20th century, if that's the result of better living through medicine, that the motto for the 21st is going to have to be better living through ecology. And I have to say, when I put this book out into the world fairly recently. I was fully expecting ecologists, with some justification, to let this molecular biologist know of all the sins that he committed and all the simplifications that I put forth. But I have to say that, to my delight, my surprise, the ecological community has been very welcoming. And I especially would say the educational community has been very welcoming. And so maybe this little contribution, this little postcard that, long 200-page postcard that started in the Serengeti, is going to bring these long separated factions of biology back together, if not in their everyday work lives in the laboratories or out in the field, but certainly in the classroom, so that the next generation of students get to see that biology is knitted together by certain general concepts, and that those boundaries are completely artificial, just a historical leftover of our inability to deal with sort of biology growing rapidly in different directions. So I'm going to turn it over to Felice. If you're ready, Felice, that's right. We're just doing this rapid fire, right? That's it. That's my boundary. That's my story. Next.
Because I'm going to show you pictures about edges. And my hope is that they're engaging enough that you might really want to pay attention to them. Because that's where I've learned about architecture. I used to inhabit that world as an architectural photographer. And that's definitely where I'm learning in science, because science happens at the edges, mostly. Darken this, I'm a photographer, I'm a control freak. I want darkness so you can see this. So yes, my life has been about basically finding edges, first in architecture, and then what's so interesting when I put this together is that I'm seeing that I sort of have the same eye. I have a very boring eye. I look at things similarly. You're seeing on your right E. coli, which I'll get to in a second. So it really is actually interesting for me personally that it is the way I sort of create order by finding the edges in my photographs and in the world, that is to say, to find order in the world. That Michael Singer, a superb artist, designed this space at Becton Dickinson. Look at his edges, how impeccable. Not only did he design them impeccably, but he thought about them later as the material would take over and muddle up the edges. Frank Lloyd Wright, I just took this at Taliesin. Louis Kahn, of course, at this brilliant, brilliant design of the sock, was clearly involved with edges. This is someday if you can make it, you have to see this place. But what's so interesting here is that you're thinking that there is this edge at the horizon, and that's the edge of the design. And as it turns out, this is what you find as you walk to the very end, and it's a whole different world of his edge. I decided to include a couple of these. This is at a memorial in Paris. You must see it if you haven't. It's the Deportation, forgive my French. He really used edges to get us to feel the place. Look at this hallway that you are walking down, and you feel the edges as if you were forced to go to this place, which will then deport you away to this frightening place, and a very brilliant use of edges in his design. And this is another interior room. There are 200,000 lights, each of them signifying the 200,000 people who were deported. Faye Jones did a beautiful job of blurring the edges. This is a pavilion in Mississippi, and he designed it so that you actually cannot tell when the edge of the architecture started and the landscape started. In fact, he brilliantly, in my opinion, used the edges of the pine coat, for example. He is abstracting the tree to create the column. He's abstracting the pine coat to its essential form and using it in the column. And he's blurring the edges, which I think makes life exciting. So in terms of my present life in science, I actually started in science, became an architectural photographer. It's a very long story. And now I'm back to science, making pictures and learning the science as I'm making pictures. Elena Boudrin was looking at E. coli under certain situations. They look and talk to each other to tell each other where to grow. Of course, it's all chemistry. Here's B. subtilis is growing in a petri dish, and notice the way I composed it by getting back to my edges. I feel more comfortable and compositionally in layering the image. Here, Jim Shapiro's lab, we're looking at Proteus colonies. I mean, look at these glorious edges that they are creating themselves. These are cells that are growing at a particular place, actually due to the nature of the nutrients in the agar. And here, you're seeing, actually there's a lot of science in this picture about gases escaping and proteins denaturing, but I played on the edges a little bit to a redundancy of the shapes to maybe make you look a little more. That's what I try to do. I try to get you to look at science so that maybe you can ask some questions about it. This was one of my very first experiences in George Whiteside's lab. They were creating various areas on a surface, hydrophobic lines that are separating these shapes. The reason why you're seeing these shapes is because I dropped colored water onto the surface, and it wet the surface and stopped at the hydrophobic lines. By the way, one of those squares measures about 4 millimeters across. It was the beginning of something called soft lithography. And those edges is, in fact, that's where the science is, because those hydrophobic lines are preventing the melding of the colors, of the watercolors together. You're looking at something called the lotus effect. That talk about an edge of a drop, that's a highly hydrophobic surface, so that when you drop a water on it, it beads up. That's what is somewhat called the lotus effect. Here's another drop. We talk about this in our book, No Small Matter. That drop has a molecular edge. What is it about a drop of water that maintains its integrity as it's dropping? And some of you who are photographers might be interested to see that that drop of water is actually acting as a lens, because the background is getting in focus. That background is out of focus because I made it that way, but with a 105 macro lens. But the drop is focusing it. Might be interesting. It's where gas escapes from beer at the edge because of the nature of the two different conditions. Here you're seeing buckling gold on a surface. It's buckling because something is happening to the substrate. Again, you're seeing amazing communication among colonies. You're seeing a yeast colony. And if we look deeper, we look at these amazing shapes and forms. This is all for real. It's all about these edges that they are forming. These pieces self-assembled because of the chemistry at their edges. They were plastic pieces about 3 millimeters across, in between two solutions, and at the interface, they are finding each other because of the nature of their chemistry. And this is from one of my students. This is an online course. This is a flatbed scanner. He poured on the flatbed scanner a supersaturated solution of sodium chloride, and he scripted the scanner to take a picture every 20 seconds, and he put it together as a movie. We had an online course, 12,000 people registered, God help us. But it was really wonderful. But anyway, the nucleation of the sodium chloride crystals is because of the edge situation. Here, Ned Thomas was looking at block copolymers, and 24 hours later, the edges disappeared and became something else. Obviously, this is much more complicated, but I'm trying to get you interested in maybe looking it up perhaps one day. I'll end with a couple of questions about edges that I'm very deeply involved with now, and that's about representing science, drawing. I don't draw at all, but my students do. And the very nature of making a representation, you have to sort of question what kind of edges you're creating. This, for example, is a picture that I made of a moire pattern. Actually, what you're seeing crazy interference, perceptions of interference, but those do not exist. You're seeing an illusion of some sort. When you're looking at a prism separating the light into its spectrum, can you really find the edge where the blue and the green separate? Not really. It's blurred, and that's all about the optics. When we're looking at shadows, this is a Marangoni effect, very complicated surface chemistry. When you look at a shadow, really look hard, and the question is, can you find an edge? Probably not. And when we represent magnetic field lines, I've always wondered about the representation of this kind of physics. Does it mean that the black area has nothing and the lines are the only place where the magnetism is? I suggest that the representations that we accept perhaps should be questioned, because it's not binary, it's a gradient of some sort. But yet this is the way we've been representing these ideas for many years. So in the end, Darwin made a beautiful representation filled with edges, getting us to change our lives, but also it's not, there's some probability in this representation that is not being shown. He's not showing extinction, for example. He is editing down the rough parts of his edge diagram, and to just keep in mind that when we are thinking about representation, we are making decisions, and the question is, are these decisions the right decisions? Thank you.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that you're here. I was recently traveling in New Guinea, and I was in the back of a pickup truck with about 5 men, and one of them, perhaps all of them, but one of them spoke English, and he had 3 wives. So I said to him, how many wives would you like to have? And there was this long pause, and I thought to myself, is he going to say 5 wives? Is he going to say 10 wives? Is he going to say 25 wives? And he leaned towards me, and he said, none. In fact, we are an animal that forms pair bonds. Having several wives can be a real toothache. We are not built to share. In 86% of world cultures permit a man to have several wives, but the vast majority of them, in the vast majority of those cultures, only about 5 or 10% of men actually do have several wives. You gotta have a lot of goats, a lot of chickens, a lot of land, a lot of education to get a woman to share your wedding bed. We are a pair bonding animal. 97% of mammals do not pair up to rear their young. People do. And so I have spent the last 40 years, actually, looking at some of the neural mechanisms that are so basic to this basic human reproductive strategy of pair bonding. And I'm best known probably for the fact that I and my colleagues have now put over 100 people into a brain scanner using functional MRI. The first were 17 people who were happily in love. The next were 15 people who had just been dumped, rejected in love. And the third group were people who were in love long term. You can remain in love, not just loving, but in love with somebody long term. We've been able to prove. But you got to choose the right person, that's for sure. So anyway, what I'd like to address here is the questions. Is technology changing love? And is the family an endangered species? I was going to end up by saying that we are in a marriage revolution, a boundary, a border, and some demographers would say that marriage revolution is as powerful as the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to end up by saying that what we're really doing right now is shedding the last 10,000 years of our agrarian tradition and moving forward to the kinds of relationships that we had a million years ago. So then, to begin, a little bit about me. I think that we've evolved three distinctly different brain systems for mating and reproduction. Sex drive, largely dominated by testosterone in both men and women. Romantic love, the elation, giddiness, euphoria, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, energy, possessiveness, craving, and motivation of early, intense romantic love. I and my colleagues have been able to prove that's largely linked with the dopamine system, probably also the norepinephrine system and low levels of serotonin. And the third basic brain system that I think evolved for mating and reproduction is attachment. That sense of calm and cosmic union you can have with a long-term partner. And other scientists have established that the main chemicals, there's going to be a lot of chemicals, just like was said before, so it's going to be all kinds of balances. But the bottom line is one of the main chemicals are oxytocin and vasopressin. I think these three basic brain systems evolved. I think they evolved together. I think that the sex drive evolved to for you to try out a whole range of partners. You don't have to love somebody to have sex with them. I think that romantic love evolved to enable you to focus your mating energy on just one at a time. And I think that that third brain system of attachment evolved to enable you to tolerate this person or stick with them at least long enough to raise a child together as a team. And there's many interesting ways that these three brain systems interact. But I want to show you a couple of things because it's going to have some meaning on where we're going in technology. Basically, we do a lot of brain scanning, as I mentioned. These three brain systems are all in part of the oldest part of the brain. Here we got the cortex, here we got the eye and the nose, and this is the brain region that's really associated actually with drive. It's the brain region for survival mechanisms. This is where thirst is orchestrated and where hunger is orchestrated, and this is where romantic love begins too. I'd always thought that romantic love was an emotion or a series of emotions and cognitive processes. It is all of that, but it is basically a drive. It's a basic drive that evolved millions of years ago, I think, to motivate us to strive for life's greatest prize, which is a mating partner. The sex drive lies largely in the hypothalamus, where that begins. They're not directly related, but once again, they're way below our thinking processes, way below the limbic system where we have our emotions. They're once again linked with drive. The third brain system of attachment, once again, way below the cognitive and the emotional parts of the brain. And I think that these evolved millions of years ago. There's a good deal of data now that by 4.4 million years ago, when our ancestors came down out of the trees, began to walk on 2 feet instead of 4, we began to evolve these mechanisms, these brain mechanisms, to drive us to begin to form pair bonds so that we could begin to raise the most helpless infants on Earth today. So certainly we still all have these basic feelings of romantic love, the sex drive, and feelings of deep attachment to the spouse. I also think that romantic love is an addiction. I've got a paper I hope going to press today on this. There's lots of characteristics that suggest that romantic love is an addiction, and we've found in the brain, not only when you're madly and happily in love, but when you've been rejected in love, activity in the main grand central station for all of the addictions, substance addictions, and all the behavior addictions. So I think it's a natural addiction, romantic love, a survival mechanism that evolved millions of years ago to focus your mating energy on just one person at a time and start the mating process. can technology change love? I cannot tell you how many people from the press have called me dedicated to the concept that technology is changing love. It is certainly changing courtship. We're emailing these days, we're texting, we've got emojis to express emotions in our text, we're sexting. It's not in regular time that we are interacting with each other. We go out in these huge groups, etc. And one would actually think that this is certainly changing courtship. But what I try to point out to people in the press is the automobile had a much bigger impact than all of this stuff. You know, in the 1940s, yes, you start having a rolling bedroom, for God's sakes, and motels and this. You know, you can text somebody, that doesn't have nowhere near the impact that a rolling bedroom might have. And how about the birth control pill in the 1960s? That had an impact. How about the Pony Express, for God's sakes? Bottom line is we've always been creating different forms of technology that are going to have an impact on how we court. Not how we love, but how we court. I do think that the modern internet is certainly expanding our dating pool. We are now able to meet people from other parts of the country of the same like-mindedness. All ages can participate. I'm the chief scientific advisor to Match.com, the internet dating site. And indeed, they have one dating site called Our Time, and it is for people over 50. And indeed, people are piling into that site. So it's now for all ages. We're getting all kinds of new courtship rules and taboos. With Match, I study all this stuff. I've actually had one questionnaire that 14 million people have taken in 40 countries. And talking about a different boundary, you know, sometimes academia and business really could work together for the use of academia, and that's what I'm trying to do. But the bottom line is, the internet cannot change the brain circuitry for romantic love. It evolved over 4 million years ago, and if we survive as a species, it will be with us 4 million years from now. It lies right next to brain regions for thirst and hunger. In fact, you know, with Match, I've told the president, I've gone through 7 presidents in 11 years here, and it's a very dynamic company. And one of the things that I keep trying to say to the various presidents is that, you know, you don't have a dating service here. You got an introducing service. This is introducing. And the moment you meet somebody in the bar or on the street or in the park or at a conference or wherever, the ancient human brain clicks into action, and you click your head and move your body and listen this way and move that way, the way we did 1 million years ago. Technology is never going to change that. As a matter of fact, I don't care. There's so many academics are thinking about, well, what if you met him on Tinder as opposed to, I don't know, in a park? It makes no difference at all whether you met him on Tinder, at Match, in a zoo, in a park, wherever. The ancient human brain will click into action, and we will court the way we always have. So basically the only true algorithm is your own human brain. We can introduce you to people, but we have to respect the fact that we got something on our shoulders that evolved a long time ago, and modern technology is not going to change that. So where are we going in terms of romance? I think we're going some different directions that have nothing to do with technology. I do an annual study with Match called Singles in America. Every year we study over 5,000 people. We do not study the Match membership. It's a representative sample of Americans based on the US Census. We've done it for 5 years, so we got now over 30,000 people. And we're just deluged in data. I do about 200 questions every year, and then I cross-tab it. This year we're doing politics. I could tell you everything about the voters for Hillary and the voters for Trump. And perhaps I will down the road. But the bottom line is, the one thing that really stood out to me every single year, and this is a trend that I think is really important. Every single year I ask, have you had a one-night stand? Have you had a friends with benefits? Not in the last year, but in your life. Or have you lived with somebody? And every year, over 50% of Americans have had a one-night stand, friends with benefits, or lived together. And I thought to myself, as most Americans always have, This is reckless. Why are people doing this? Sex is metabolically expensive. You can have a lot of trouble from this. There's got to be some Darwinian reason that this is going on. And in fact, I then began to run into one particular data point, and that is that 67% of cohabiting couples are scared to death of the social, legal, emotional, and economic consequences of divorce. And it suddenly occurred to me, perhaps this is not recklessness that we're climbing into bed really fast and tying the knot really way down the road, but caution. In fact, what I think is going on, and what I wrote in Nautilus magazine, is what I call slow love. I think what we're seeing now is a real extension of the pre-commitment stage before marriage. I think we're so scared of divorce, and I think we have an awful long time during our 20s to find the right person. We're going to try to get in bed with them instantly. You learn a lot about somebody between the sheets, and then if that seems to work out, you move into a friends with benefits. Don't tell your friends and family yet, and eventually you move in together. So I think we're seeing a long, long period of getting to know somebody before we tie the knot. In fact, I call it slow love. Where marriage used to be the beginning of a relationship, now it's the finale. They will marry, though. It's just later. And I thought to myself, all right, if you've got this long pre-commitment stage, slow love, before you actually marry the person, perhaps during that long period of time, all the bad relationships can end. In which case, maybe we're going to see more happy marriages, because the bad ones will have died out before they actually walk down the marriage aisle. So I did a study with Match, and of almost 1,100 married people. Not on Match, of course, but 1,100 married people. And I asked them a lot of questions. But one of the questions was, would you remarry the person that you're currently married to? And 81% said yes. Maybe. Now, we're also going to see new forms of marriage. And I think what's really interesting here is that 36% of Americans, singles, they want a prenup. Even when they marry the person, they want to make sure they can get out. They want to make sure, the caution is staggering. But it's logical. We've got so much property. We're going to live a very long time. We can protect ourselves from disease in this long pre-commitment stage. We don't have to walk the walk of shame if we have had sex before we married. So it seems to be the right time in human evolution to have this long pre-commitment stage and have some real ways to back out. Well, the most interesting of all the facts, and I've got just hundreds of thousands of them over the last 5 years, is that 33% of singles think that it's okay to leave a satisfactory marriage, if you are no longer in love. It's a staggering statistic to me. For thousands of years, when we lived on the farm, you had to marry well. You had to marry somebody from the right kin connection, the right background, the right religion, acceptable by the community, acceptable by your family, and hopefully somebody who lived in the farm next door so you can put your property together. Virginity at marriage, arranged marriages, concept that a woman's place is in the home, that man is the head of the household, to honor thy husband and till death do us part. All of these basic concepts evolved some 10,000 years ago with the beginning of the agrarian tradition. And they're almost all gone. In my studies, 1/3 of American single men would not go out with a virgin. Now, in my day, I'm old, they wouldn't go out with you if you weren't a virgin. Now, this is a dramatic change. All of this is slipping away from us, particularly the concept, honor thy husband and till death do us part. And in this way, I think we're shedding 10,000 years of the agrarian tradition and all of the beliefs that go with that, and moving forward to the kinds of relationships that we had 1 million years ago. For millions of years, we lived in little hunting and gathering groups on the grasslands of Africa. Women commuted to work to gather their fruits and vegetables. They came home with 60 to 80% of the evening meal. The double income family was the rule. Women were regarded as just as sexually and socially and economically powerful as men. And if a couple couldn't get along, they packed up their few belongings and left. As a matter of fact, in hunting and gathering societies, we now think that men and women tended to have 2 or 3 spouses during the course of their life. Serial pair bonding, a series of marriages, something that we are once again seeing today. So, I'm actually quite optimistic about this. People say that technology is the biggest deal in the last 50 years. Sociologists would end up saying that the most powerful social movement in the last 150 years is women piling into the job market in cultures around the world. This is what seems to be changing family circumstances. We're now beginning to see peer marriages or symmetrical marriages, marriages between equals. We've come to regard our primary relationship as the core of social life. In farming societies, the core of your social life was the community, your relationship with God, and your relationship with your extended family. We're now focused really on just this one relationship. We're working harder on our relationships than we ever have. The amount of advice books is off the top. Divorce rate is stable. I've studied divorce in 80 societies. I don't have time to talk about that, but it's stable right now for various ecological reasons, I think, and I think will remain that way. We're seeing happier marriages because bad marriages can end, bad relationships can end before they get married. We've seen this long middle age, so if you didn't get it right the first time, you got a few more chances. Got all kinds of new technologies to sustain sex and romance and feelings of attachment. We've got Viagra, we've got estrogen replacement, we've got hip surgery and cataract surgery and all kinds of things to sort of stay young and stay in the game. And sure enough, we've got all kinds of tools to find new people. So I just will end by saying, we got a lot to cry about. There's plenty to cry about. The thing that I cry about, actually, is the loss of local community. People are so upset about a single parent, or I'm upset even about 2 parents. For millions of years, we lived in these hunting and gathering groups where if you got fed up with your kid, you gave it to your aunt and your cousin and your sister and your da-da-da-da. And as we lose divorce and adultery and remarriage, they've been around forever. But local community, the loss of local community is new, and I think quite a staggering experience. But the bottom line is we got more powerful women, we got both sexes in the job market, we got the double income family, women are just as educated these days as men are, and both men and women of every stripe in life can now make the kinds of relationships that they want to make. That boundary in which we were contained for some 10,000 years is disappearing. And in that way, I think we're moving forward to the kinds of lifestyle that is highly compatible with the ancient human spirit. Thank you.
Okay, for something completely different. I want to take you to our old hometown, Amsterdam. This is the Royal Palace. It was built in 1655. It was actually City Hall at the time, the grandest building in the Netherlands. And it's wonderful because there's these great engraved maps on the floor in marble. The Eastern and the Western Hemisphere and actually the stars. And the great thing is, if you look at the Western Hemisphere, you see this kind of incomplete picture of the Americas. And I find it always kind of astonishing. If you walk on it, you can walk on it. You actually see this is something, we're at that time still in the time where we're exploring the world. And I think it's an extremely brave piece of art because it's kind of left open this whole part. So if you want to kind of think of what is the edge of the unknown, you can kind of physically see it there engraved. So this is very different from other maps. Like for instance, these kind of maps, typically what they have, if there were empty blank spots on the maps, map makers would kind of fill them in with all these kind of sea animals. So I feel that's kind of some way in which we kind of dealt with the, this kind of edge, this boundary of our knowledge, that we have to project something in these kind of blank spots. It's very difficult to think about the unknown. And in some sense, my small presentation here, which will be kind of a little bit about the geometry and the geography of these edges, thinking of edges of knowledge. I think it's really about kind of conquering these sea animals. I always feel like scientists are on these little boats trying to find out what's there, and of course there are never really sea animals. I like to call it kind of dark knowledge, this kind of knowledge of that what we do not know. It's kind of what Donald Rumsfeld would call the known unknowns. And it's kind of inspired by this number that all of you probably know, that cosmologists have figured out that in terms of the material content, the energy content of the universe, our present knowledge of physics only covers 5%. So everything you know about particles, about radiation, the most exotic particles found in particle accelerators, all of them added together account for 5%. So 95% is kind of our percentage of dark knowledge in physics. And often it's a very interesting discussion to ask any kind of scholar or scientist, what's your percentage of dark matter? What do you know that you do not know? In fact, it's funny that, for instance, if you study ancient Greek, that the number of Greek plays by the great authors that were carried over is roughly 3 to 5%. So you also know exactly what you don't know in that case, because there are lists of published works, but of course the works themselves have disappeared. A few words about kind of these principles about going in the unknown. I always very much like this kind of phrase by Richard Feynman saying science as the belief in the ignorance of experts. And I think the kind of the great difficulty of exploring that edge is really kind of to keep up that open mind. There's a nice quip of him, I think, that it should be belief in the ignorance of experts, not the expertise of ignorance. And another great quote from me is this from Francis Crick, collaborator of Jim Watson, saying that any theory that can account for all the facts is wrong because some of the facts are always wrong. And I want to show you, some of you have seen before, my favorite example of that, which is this famous case that happened a few years ago in England, where somebody was making an omelet. And so this woman broke the first egg, and it turned to have 2 yolks. Then she broke the second one, 2 yolks. The third one, the fourth, the fifth, and the sixth. And by that time, they called the journalist. There was like pictures were made of it. And then there was this long debate in the English press about how this could happen, because typically 1 in 1,000 egg has a double yolk. So this is like an incredibly improbable event that happened. And then there was a long public discussion, and there were like kind of biologists, I like to say chicken and egg experts, and it was, oh well, perhaps these eggs were all of a certain size, perhaps there were hormones involved, perhaps these were eggs that came from the same chicken, and then it's a lovely anecdote because one of these experts, an expert in probability, he said he was like walking late at night in the supermarket and certainly saw boxes, double yolked eggs. And it's kind of the perfect example, I think, that why as a scientist you always have to keep an open mind about these issues. Actually, the main point I want to talk about here is about the edge of science, not in going in the abstract world of the unknown, but about the edge of science interacting with society. And that's actually where I want to make kind of a case. So my case is following, I would like to call it the kind of the knowledge paradox, the kind of paradox of increased progress in knowledge. Because if you think about what does research do, it always explores new things, things that are more difficult to see, things that are more complicated to understand, more difficult to compute, perhaps more abstract, for instance, in mathematics. In some sense, knowledge, increased knowledge, always moves away from us. In some sense, to go from the latest finding in a laboratory to your everyday life, it's a longer path that you have to travel. And that it means that we need many, many more stages in bringing that, so to say, to the surface that we can understand. So in that sense, you would say that knowledge disappears from us. And you could be very pessimistic and say at some point, knowledge is, so few experts will understand it, that basically it's invisible. It's infinitely far away from us. On the other hand, and there are wonderful examples in technology, in medicine, that all that increased knowledge, think about, for instance, information technology, makes this knowledge much more applicable. Think about the genetic revolution. In the 1950s, of course, DNA was an abstract concept. Now it's actually used in personalized medicine. The phone in my pocket has an infinite, almost infinite amount of increased power compared to the first mainframe computers. So in that sense, science is actually getting closer to us. There's almost not a single issue, I would say, in society that doesn't hinge on science. So you might say, well, it's actually the opposite. It's literally in your bloodstream. It's literally in your back pocket. So it's infinitesimally close by. So I think that's the paradox. How can be something very far away and very close by? And the image I want to project, and that's perhaps the only thing I really want to say here, is that I feel that border between science and society, which used to be very strict. The scientists had a lab coat or this long beard, and were very authoritative, and there were just a handful of them. And then there was the rest of us. And I think these days, I feel it's much more like this. I would actually say that the boundary between science and society has become a kind of a fractal thing. As you know, fractals are beautiful mathematical things. They have some self-replication in them, and technically they have an infinite long edge. So if you want to live along the edge, in the limiting case, you would have an infinite long region to explore. And I think there are various reasons for this. It's the growth of science, it's the growth of communications, and it's also the changing society. I think you can see that in some sense that kind of these, of course, fractal, they're beautiful mathematical objects. You know, you have these wonderful trees, and actually that tree is a good image to take. In some sense, I would say this is the tree of knowledge, the old biblical concept. In fact, if you go to the 13th century, you see here it is, the Arbor Scientia. There's a kind of a very modest tree. It has not more than 10 branches, a very concise view of the world of knowledge. If you go to the Enlightenment and the end of the 18th century, that's the famous encyclopédie of Diderot and d'Alembert. And you know, the first volume has this, it's a huge book if you've seen it. But actually this page is 9 times folded in. And it's their depiction to describe the tree of knowledge as it was at the late 18th century. You know, of course, this is in no way readable. And these days you can go to the internet and find much more beautiful visualization of science. It looks something like this. This is kind of the roadmap to academia. And I would say kind of the fractal nature already stares us in the face. In fact, there is also kind of a geographical version of that. This is this wonderful map that was produced a few years ago of all scientific collaborations. I feel it's a little bit like the map in your in-flight magazine. Actually, I always like it because the Netherlands is here. It's a pretty intense, bright spot here. So I think many of us in the scientific community are actually making these trips to these. So that actually gets an indication of the great complexity. And I would say actually that's something that I sometimes worry about. Because that vastly fractal tree of knowledge, I think, creates a similar kind of academic architecture. And it's this famous saying that the world has problems, the university has departments. You know, but in some sense, our subdivisions, we heard about ecological and molecular biology, but of course, this kind of second law of academia, that you only add academic fields. You never kind of merge them. So the question is, you know, how does this complicated fractal structure interact with society? And of course, there's a second thing. I think information is similar, atomized or fragmented. This is kind of a statement of saying that basically everybody consults the University of Google, you know, and of course that information is typically not validated. Although there might be terrific sites, and I'm looking at Wikipedia all the time. And it's kind of nicely summarized by this kind of saying by the particle physicist Sidney Coleman, the problem with the global village is all the global village idiots. And I must say, I've had very prestigious colleagues that sometimes tell me, oh, Robert, you look at this paper. And then I kind of Google, yes, I Google the author, and see that that author also has a whole body of work about the so-called moon landings and the Kennedy assassination. And so, in some sense, it's very difficult for us to find our way. And this in particular, I think, if we focus not on society as a whole, but politics. So science and politics have this kind of opposite world. And I think these are certainly the two forces that are driving this edge in this very wiggly and complicated shape. So if you think about what is science, now we think typically of universal, literally. It's very precise, it's very rational, it's about long-term goals, and it's kind of win-win, because if you learn something, we add knowledge every minute in the scientific process. Well, politics is very different. It's usually national, regional. There's not really world government. It has to be ambiguous. You see this in the present election. Nobody makes a very precise statement. It's very emotional, and it's short-term. A day is often an infinite amount of time, certainly in a political campaign, but actually I think also in the average life of a politician. And it's in many ways, precise ways, zero-sum, certainly if it goes about votes. So these kind of worlds are very different, and they're driving into each other. And because of all these complexities, that discussion becomes very complex. I show this picture just to show how a reasonable solution looks like. This is a page from a beautiful book by David McKay about sustainable energy, providing possible solutions of an energy distribution for a country using renewable energy. And the only thing I want to get, this is extremely difficult for a politician to communicate this message. In fact, it's often this is turned around and against us. If you think about, for instance, this is a slide that was produced to make jokes about Obamacare, just to show how complicated it is, so it must be kind of wrong or something. And you see politicians often using this word. I'm not a scientist, but. No, you use the complexity against us. There's even a word for this, hyperscience. If you can deal with the conclusions of science, you ask for more research and more things. So there's, of course, a lot of kind of criticism of these phenomena. And so we have to ask, is this a good thing or a bad thing? This kind of democratization of science, the fact that now anybody can access it at all possible times, and that we have this very complex situation. Somebody said that actually what's happening is that the typical citizen is becoming a proto-scientist. They're taking off certain of the things that scientists felt that were exclusive to the scientific community. Namely, being a skeptical, want to be convinced, do some research yourself, and of course in a very limited way. So I think the fractal boundary is not only going into society, but actually could go in our lives. People might have actually some scientific instincts in them. And I think we have to deal with that. I think it's a very, very important societal phenomenon. I think it also changes, so my favorite introduction of this is now, if men really want to make a point and be authoritative, they wear a dress. And this is like the classical way of settling an argument that science, of course, use, which is kind of, as mathematicians call, proof by intimidation. It's one of the many ways of proving. Another one is proving because 3 committees have recommended it. So that's, and I think this is typical, I would say, kind of the old-fashioned attitude. When we had a very clear border between science and society, it was clear who was standing on which side and how you would make the argument. And I think, honestly, these good old days, often I think the audience was not participating, didn't really believe or was able to follow the argument, but just took it on good faith, as they took many other things, that this was the truth and this is what they have to be accepted. And of course, you already feel my argument coming, that I think that might not be a good thing. And I think, and my point would be that in the end, although this is an incredibly troublesome and complicated times, I think we will benefit. I think science has always benefited from opening up. The moment where book publishing was possible, think about the beginning of the scientific revolution in the 17th century, the fact that knowledge was not only in the exclusive domain of a very small sect, that actually people, of course in the beginning only those who had the means, were able to do experiments themselves, see with their own eyes what was happening. Actually, that was a great advantage. One of my favorite anecdotes is that when the Royal Society in England was started by King Charles II, this is a wonderful line in Samuel Pepys' diaries, where he's visiting the court, and the king is kind of making fun of these scientists of the Royal Society because they are weighing air. Of course, they were doing sophisticated experiments about air pressure, But you know, for the court, this was like the most vacuous thing to do, to weigh air. So I want to kind of end, so this is easy to think that we are kind of being invaded by barbarians. And I want to bring you to a kind of great book written about this by Italian author Alessandro Barrico, I Barbari. I think it's also translated into English. And it's a wonderful, because he describes all these forces. Kind of the superficiality of modern life. You know, how, I think one of the examples, how the bouillabaisse, you know, the great French fish soup, is replaced by the McDonald's, and it's like all the laments. And then he makes another point. And he makes that point very clearly at the final scene of the book. Because he visits actually China, and he goes to the Chinese Great Wall. And so he said, this is the original thing. This was built to keep the barbarians out. And he's on the wall, and you know, if you've been there, it's winding all the way down. You know, it's really a fractal form. And at some point, he's in the wall, and he's confused. On which side is China, and which side are the barbarians? And for him, this is an enlightened moment. He thinks, wait a moment, you know. There is a certain way in which we should not be afraid of the barbarians. In some sense, we are all barbarians. Going back to the beginning of my presentation, the moment we entered this unknown world, we were basically also climbing over the wall. And I think that is in some sense a very powerful, also a deep statement. It's also confusing and a little bit disorienting. I must say this, I read the book because somebody said, well, I read the book, Robert, and it reminded me of you. And I think that that's a good thing or not. But perhaps that's my takeaway. I think this edge, the edge of science and society, is evolving very rapidly. I think its complexity we are confronted with every day. I think most of us, in the end, like these fractal figures, they will fill the whole plane. So, you know, it will come, and you will be somewhere on the edge, and we will all be on the edge. And I think that's a good way to finish the talk. Thank you very much.
I hardly know where to begin, but in some sense, the two of you said something that resonated with me, and that this may not be a correct connection. But for Robert, one of the really interesting digressions that the Oppenheimer brothers had with each other was Robert, the experts should know things and make decisions, and Frank thinking you have to get everybody involved. Everybody has to learn and understand and be engaged. Part of what's happened is this, we've got this us against them mentality. So when you were talking about oxytocin as an attractant, it also has this other effect, right? Of us against them. If we bond with you and then we expel the other one. Oh dear.
I can summarize the.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, it's kind of fascinating because there are kind of two, as you said, there are two models.
Yes.
One kind of embracing this, and the other perhaps more fighting it. And perhaps the two Oppenheimer brothers were in two sides of that argument. I think actually that you don't have a choice because, as I said, you know, this is not something that's driven. It's driven by kind of autonomous forces. So I think, you know, from the scientific community, and this is something I don't have to explain to any people here in the audience, but in some sense we have a certain need to turn ourselves inside out. And, you know, reach out and communicate, because that's something in the spirit of things. I think going to the old model of, you know, being only authoritative, I think I totally don't see this working anymore. And I think actually that's something where it's not about the changing nature of science. I think it's also the changing nature of society that will not allow that anymore.
Exactly, that we have to concede that the village idiot actually is probably someone we should
Sometimes
be talking
the
to.
village idiots are right, or
Exactly,
even more right than the experts.
Is what I said about the other side of oxytocin, of the attraction, and how that can make you be then against, you attract by fighting against other people, is that correct? Us against them?
Yeah.
I think it's basic human nature.
Right.
You know, I was just thinking about what you were saying. I think actually the great 21st century issue is the degree to which each one of us wants intimacy, to be connected, and the degree to which each one of us wants autonomy. And it's not as much the them and us, it's those two parts of oneself.
Right.
And the balance. But what's nice about these days is that we do have the opportunity to express both, or our ratio of them in the ways that we want to. We're not confined by we're not as confined as we have been for the last 10,000 years.
So in a way, I mean, it's interesting because everyone, in some sense or another, is talking about embracing these ambiguities and boundaries that aren't. And I was also really interested when Sean was talking, because I know you did cross a lot of boundaries, and every university and every institution like this talks about we have to bring down the silos and we have to do cross-disciplinary work, and it's almost impossible to make that actually happen. So I'm wondering how you were able to do that, what you think it was about this book that didn't make the ecologist hate you, and how you think that's going to go on in the future so we could make that really...
I won't, it's too early to predict. I'm going to go back. Part of my, it's actually a little surprise to me, but I've seen it happen before, because the other sort of sister to ecology is evolutionary science, evolutionary biology, and it got siloed away also. And when I started, let's just say the mid-'80s or early '90s, again, I have to look at my own tribe. There was a lot of apathy about evolutionary science. And so I've seen the transformation, happen before, of where estranged disciplines came back together. And there's all sorts of, I don't know if I'd issue any generality about how that starts to happen. But I think it's been known for a long time in science that what has to happen is the old people have to die. And the young people don't, the younger scientists who are interested in synthesis and integration and new ideas and in frontiers, they invent fields that didn't have a name before. The name on the building doesn't apply anymore. The professor of X isn't relevant anymore. That's the sort of natural turnover process. And so we're all basically just living out our little window of time until our view of the world is sort of obsolete, and the next generation comes around and reshapes it. I think we're going to understand that's going to be the dynamics. The problem for institutions is they can't adapt at the level that sort of that intellectual activity is evolving.
Yeah. So in a way, we're being forced one way or the other to do this and to cross these boundaries. And the only question is how well we're going to do it. From Felice's talk, one of the things I was wondering was about, focusing on edges and how we can't see anything if we don't see the edges. But they can also be, as you mentioned, so deceptive and create illusions. I always loved the question in Trivial Pursuit, how many colors are there in the rainbow? And I thought, what are they talking about? There's an infinite number of colors in the rainbow. But there are some amazing illusions at the Exploratorium where you see two very different, say, squares, or they look different, and you eliminate the edge, and suddenly you see there is no difference. They're two things that are the same.
Do you like the new Exploratorium?
Oh, that's a complicated question.
I was just there, and it's the first time I've been there. You saw the original,
Yes.
and the design of the intention was to discover.
Yes.
You don't.
This
need
is
to
going to
touch
get
it.
us off topic, but it's something that I want to say anyway when it comes to museums and educational institutions. There are a lot of things that would have Frank Oppenheimer rolling in his grave, including how expensive it is and how much more controlled environments need to be. But that is the world. And if you're not going to pay taxes to support museums and schools, you can't really get upset when they're expensive and the schools are bad and churn out. I mean, the whole structure has changed so that what we had could not exist today. I do like it, but it's different. It's like your children go off and they become something entirely new, and you either, as you said, you die off at some point. There's still some staff members who are still there from the early days, but eventually you have to make your peace with what's on the other side of your life and on the boundary and what's actually happening out there.
I wanted to. I'm sorry. I was curious because I was just there. On my campus, I've been at MIT. It's about 24 years now. I can't believe it. It's been wonderful. But I'm seeing some major changes there's extraordinary interdisciplinary collaboration going on constantly. In fact, I formally work for 4 departments. Mechanical engineering, the work goes from structures in bridges to molecular structures. It runs the whole spectrum. And there are new departments, medical engineering. You know, we're bringing in all chemists and physicists are all working together. Yet, in the end, it feels like ultimately this is all happening depending upon the funding mechanism.
Yeah, exactly.
That it's where the neuroscience is exploding because that's where the money is.
Yeah, exactly. I'm wondering, too, since we have so little time, usually in these discussions it's kind of easy for me to pick out a common theme, but I'm wondering, and I'm having a much harder time this time, which is really interesting because there's such different kinds of borders, but I wonder if one of you wants to talk about a commonality or something you heard in somebody else's talk that gave you insight into the boundaries and borders that you were thinking about, or the edges.
I don't know if I can go 4 for 4 here, but I want to go over to something Robbert said, and this is about the changing relationship of science to society, and I'm just going to take a wild guess that might interest some collection of people that are here. In talking about, well, it can't be the old authoritative model, and you got to listen to the village idiots. I think we're suffering from the communication mechanisms have changed, and that the interface for communication of science was, of course, what we'll just call the legitimate media, and that the village idiots now, have as large or larger, a communication empire as others, and I think that's creating a lot of struggle. And I don't want to pick on anybody in particular, but I'll take one. I don't think it's a healthy thing to have Robert De Niro talking about vaccines on the Today Show. I don't think that's going to get us anywhere. In fact, I can from a scientific point of view, it's backpedaling over settled issues. And yet, the inclination is because it's Robert De Niro, they want him on the Today Show. It's not. I think we're struggling as a scientific community about how to move everyone forward when there's a lot of countercurrent of going backwards.
I must say, I always have the kind of metaphor of the immune system. So I think, lots of viruses are evolving, and I think as a scientific community, should evolve similar kind of antibodies to this. And I think that's basically my point, because I think if you see this, I think typical example is like the talk show format. Now you will have 2 people discussing. One could be indeed a movie actor just with an idea, not bound by any literature or logic. The other could be somebody representing tens of thousands of scientists, but it's always, if it's one-on-one, it's always a draw. And so I think that in that sense, it's really related to how do we build the architecture on the scientific side, so that we can at least be up to the level of this kind of completely different world that's outside.
Exactly. We need to evolve to be able to do that. I think we're probably out of time. Is that correct?
I think probably we should kind of move to drinks.
We should move to drinks. Thanks everybody so much. It's been so much fun, and everybody was so